suffering wholeheartedly. I really don't want to record today. This is all your fault.
I rejoice in your misery. It is a palate of unquestionable delicacy.
That's not very brotherly of you. I expect at least a teaspoon of compassion once every decade.
I don't deal in teaspoons. I only deal in French amounts. Such a bad segue.
That was terrible.
It really was.
At the same time, it almost makes sense.
But part of the problem is that ounces is universal.
Yes.
Because like in my head, I was thinking like ounces is like in teaspoons. But I was wanting going more like powder shaker as you sprinkle salt across your wounds.
Right. I'm even more confused
I
now.
assure you, I am a genius. You just don't have the mental capacity to realize it yet.
My doubt is as grand as the ocean is deep. Anyways, today we are reviewing a book by Christopher Mitchell
Titled The Mortal Blade.
Ooh,
A huge city ruled by gods, eternally besieged by monsters.
Green lizards. Not dragons, but green lizards, basically.
And they have next to nothing to do with the actual plot of the book.
Yes.
Which is ever so slightly disappointing.
They're kind of more of a situation. Or,
They just were largely irrelevant to the book. Their color. But which is kind of a shame because like the concept of a city that's eternally besieged is actually kind of a unique and interesting concept if it was properly explored.
Yeah.
And they make it explored further on in the series because the series is titled The Eternal Siege.
And it's like something like 9 books long or something.
Which is just really overambitious.
But at the same time, it kind of feels like they're going to get out of the city fairly
I
soon.
know, that's...
But let's actually finish with the synopsis.
That basically was the synopsis.
No, the synopsis is Courtney Holdfast, our main character, gets kidnapped from an alternate realm, which is a great deal of mumbo-jumbo hocus pocus that gets completely not forgotten about, but yada 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 in a fantastic way.
And it actually didn't bother me at all because like I didn't need to know any of that. Just the
Right,
fact that
so it was actually an excellent display of this is not necessarily information. I'm just going to yada yada it and push it to a different book while also dramatically expanding the world of the story takes place because, this is a multiverse we're dealing with here, and that was conveyed in a completely offhand manner. But anyway, Courtney Holdfast gets kidnapped from his realm and brought over and said, "Here, you're now a slave soldier. Have fun on the wall. Go get yourself killed fighting these giant green lizards that attack every summer." And that's just one of the characters.
And then we have Ayla, the half-goddess, Immortal.
She's not a half-goddess, she's a full goddess. There are no half-gods. Well, okay, she's like a three-quarter goddess. It gets complicated, but...
You have various half-gods and quarter-gods, but they're all immortal. It's just, and there's very little power differential behind the various gods, and that's one of like the major, well, I guess not major criticisms, but the actual selection of powers for their gods was extremely underwhelming.
It was almost like the only god whose ability we delved into at all was Ayla's.
Because she's a focal point character, so we get to see her use it a fair amount.
And she actually uses it well, but
it's just underwhelming. Because all she can do is she can change her features by her appearance via an illusion. And yes, that's decent magic, but for a character that is labeled a god and rules over a city, it's like...
Yeah, they're not necessarily, or at least some of the sons and daughters of the primary two gods are not necessarily titans of magical
None of the
power.
gods are, not even the original gods. They all only had one ability, even the original gods.
Well, I don't even know what the original gods had for abilities, per se.
They say somewhere in the book, but I can't remember.
Regardless, let's continue directing the ship back onto the synopsis. Ayla is. The gods are dictators, and they're slowly bringing the city to ruin through mismanagement.
And we're coming a couple hundred years after there was a divine civil war where various...
Which is actually one of the best parts of the book.
Yes, because Ayla is a survivor of the losing side of the Civil War, and
we're reformists to stop bullying the people around, give them some freedoms, yada yada yada.
And so this puts her in a very, very powerful narrative position where she is still trying to help the people in whichever way she can, lift them up, etc., from their oppression, despite all the higher powers that actually control and run the city being actively opposed to this, and her having to do this in secret while being watched and all this, and
suffering extreme depression over the fact that everyone she actually liked from her family was killed during the Civil War. So she routinely goes a decade-long drug binges where she just basically taps out of reality, which she can do because she's an immortal god and whatever. But
so it's like her character was the strongest for me.
Yes,
because her internal conflicts are compelling, her motivations, and you like her and the way she inhabits
her
the story.
Her interactions with most of the characters are deeply emotional and driven from the people she likes to the people she distrusts to the people she would like to basically spill their guts out and then set fire to the things while they're still alive. She has a wealth of fantastic relationships, both friends and foes.
Yeah. Then we also have Daniel,
who is actually kind of my favorite character.
I kind of dislike Daniel.
But that's the point.
Yes, and so, in a general, just to sort of step out a moment, I found the characters as a whole a mixed bag.
Yes.
Some of them, like Daniel, had very clear objectives that you find it difficult to root for because they're negative.
Okay, so I didn't like Daniel. I found him incredibly interesting to read.
I didn't even find him particularly interesting to read because he had so little individual agency. He had objectives that were put upon him by his family, and he often failed in those objectives, but he kind of failed up. And when he was put against moral quandaries, he again failed to take a proper stance, either direction.
But to some extent, that's actually kind of why I like the character. So, to actually explain the character a little, you have the city, it's eternally under siege, and then you have the poor district, and then you have the rich people district, which is governed by 10 ancient families. Daniel is a scion of one of these 10 ancient families, but his house is in decline. And so his mother is constantly pushing Daniel to ascend and make something of himself so that he can, pushing him to marry well and basically bring the family back to greatness, restore life and vigor to the house. Daniel is at once incredibly weak-willed, where he will not step up to his family at all, and it basically just does what he is told, right? But it's not because he's a bland character. It's because he simply does what he is told, and he is eminently aware of his position. The fact that, he's doing nothing, right? And he wants a position in the military where he does nothing, right? And he basically just wants to sit around, do nothing, while his mother says, go join the military, go marry well. And he just doesn't want to do these things because it can't be troubled, right? And he doesn't really care about the family. He doesn't care about anything except kind of goofing off, except it's not even that. He wants to read books and be ignored. He doesn't even this is kind of what's interesting, because his family, I'm doing a really bad job of this because it's probably getting boring, but his family is, we are superior. Our bloodline is superior. Those are commoners. They aren't even a tenth of what we are. that very imperialistic, noble bloodline type thing, which he does not buy into. But he does not contend with his family because it's not worth the fight to him.
But he also hasn't been pushed, or it's like it's where the character is going that's interesting. But the character doesn't take enough steps. He doesn't get pressured or molded at all.
That's also why I kind of find him interesting, is because he's put into these moral quandaries, right? Okay, he gets a job in the military, right? Via nepotism. And he is instantly put on the front lines of a civil revolt, which happens every decade or so, right? And so this is where we get his first iota of him actually putting a little effort into his job. And his job is like, all my troops are going to get back safe from this, right? And then, but at the same, as he's running around doing his jobs, he eventually gets put into a situation and he kind of accidentally commits a war crime. And so he's guilty of this. So he gets all of his troops out, and he goes to his officer and he tries to put himself on report. But because of the nature and the politics of the city, everyone is like, yes, you showed those rebellious scum, and they're clapping him on the back.
He is hailed as a war hero and immediately elevated
to a standard. And he's like, okay, I'm not sure I did the correct thing, but he just rides this out because it's like, why am I going to kick and scream and get myself punished over this? And so he just kind of takes what's given, and he's just about, and it's like he's constant, and he's like, it's a constant dialogue of in his head. He's like, I don't feel comfortable about having done this war crime, right? But everyone around him is hailing him as a war hero because of what he did. And he's not arguing with them. And I find it actually really interesting because he is kind of perfectly balanced between a nihilist and just the barest smidgen of having morality.
Yeah, I found it difficult to really invest in the character because...
Oh, I wasn't invested in the character, I just found
But that's part of... Like, when I say I've found the characters a mixed bag, is that you have some characters that have really strong objectives. In Daniel, like, he has a very clear objective throughout the entire book, in of himself or thrust upon him, but he's not a character you like. You find it hard to root for his objective.
Yes.
Ergo, you find it hard to invest in him as a character. And then you have characters more like Maddie, who we haven't got to yet, who you like, and you really like her interactions with Black Rose because they're complex, not morally, but just relationshiply and emotionally complex, but she has no clear objective. You don't know what the character is doing except sort of just existing in the story, so it's like nothing's really happening. And it's like Ayla is the only character that really combines.
Ayla is the only character that has a personal goal and is self-motivated toward that goal and pursues it.
And it's also a goal that you can root for and invest in.
Daniel does not have a personal goal. He is given goals and he pursues those goals, which in itself is kind of interesting, but also struggles to make the character feel self-determining.
Yes, and
Maddie has no personal goal, but you root for the character. However, she is once again not self-determining because she doesn't pursue any particular goals.
Yes, and not a whole lot happens in her chapters per se. Because like the book has an overarching narrative that never really happens until the last 10, 20%. It's like it just does. You get
the book spends a lot of time twiddling its thumbs, and it's actually not even twiddling its thumbs. The book spends a lot of time twiddling its thumbs and allowing the characters to get to know each other, giving the characters time to get to know each other, so that the last 20% of the book, the story can actually get started.
And I never, like, all the individual chapters were entertaining or interesting or fun, but it did kind of, you could tell the lack of a real narrative.
And the main lack of a narrative was the fact that only one of the characters had a personal goal they were pursuing. Once again, that is Ayla, right? And the only other character with any kind of goal, Daniel, that goal was given to him and said, basically, I'm gonna say weaponized, right? The fourth character, who we only touched on briefly, Korthi,
has no goal
Because it's
at all, and doesn't even have particularly interesting character action. Not actively dislike, but he was the character I liked the least. I could have completely done without
charming
Korthi.
moments for me, but
Charming moments. The most interesting thing about Korthi was his faith that his sister was going to come and rescue him.
right. So
And the weight the narrative put upon his sister was really cool because she builds in the back of your mind as this oncoming sort of.
right. So so Korthi obviously gets kidnapped from his dimension and brought here to fight a war that is not his. He makes no effort to escape and of himself because he has this almost divine faith in his sister, who is this constantly comes up as this massive powerhouse who is going to come rescue him, tear holes in the fabric of reality, and drag him back home safely, and basically fight all the gods of this city single-handedly. And he has this complete unshakable faith in her, and it's really cool.
Yeah.
However, he has such faith in his sister that he kind of just sits around kicking his heels, waiting to be rescued, right? And
nothing happens with the character until the later part of the book, and I even have kind of larger issues with the character at that point to some extent, because Ayla's narrative only lasts the first half of the book, because then it shifts gears into a romance with Korthi, and that romance completely erases any of the narrative that really gave her character strength, and it's not a particular unique or interesting or compelling romance.
It's an exceedingly poorly handled romance because it's they meet once and basically they fall madly in love.
Mm-hmm.
Only it's even worse. It's not madly in love. It's a madly in love where they both instantly recognize that they're doomed lovers, and they try to fight their emotions for all of one chapter before giving in and then having a massive emotional breakdown as one of them says, "I can't stay here," initially, right? One of them gets incredibly angry at the other because the second one admits that that the romance is doomed.
They don't even have like a particularly large amount of chemistry. They don't. And like
They spend
Korthi is fully intending to just bail, but also has no internal agency, which completely saps his character of any connection to Ayla.
They don't even have any interactions together, really.
They have a couple.
They have like the chapter in which they meet and fall in love. They exchange like maybe a paragraph of lines, and then you skip time where they're drinking under a tree together, and then they're madly in love, right? That is the start of their romance. Their first meeting, they exchange 5 lines, jump skip of them drinking together, doomed lovers.
Yeah, it's not interesting. It's not fun. It's not anything.
And it actually could have been because Korthi, or what I would have liked to see is because Ayla is working undercover to help the people, the oppressed people of her city, right? And this is all very hush-hush because she is frowned upon and kind of ostracized by the other gods. And so then Korthi comes in, and he is kind of an oddball in the city because he actually has divine powers in of himself,
while not being a god.
And so instantly, I would have liked to see this kind of cat and mouse game where she is looking at him and she sees the ways he's interacting with people, and she starts feeling him out. Like, is he a potential ally, right? And I'm not entirely sure where his part of the story is, but eventually you work their way around to both the romance and the fact that they are allies, where she convinces him to stay and help, right? And then the romance starts blooming from there.
And just give him some level of interaction with the narrative, with any of the narratives going around.
That being said, Korthi does I found he has charming scenes, because to explain, you obviously have the greenskins and they attack the city every summer, yada yada yada, and one of the city's primary defenses is they have big-ass dragon run around and basically torch the greenskin army. It's kind of cool. But this dragon, like all dragons, as all dragons should be, is incredibly prideful, short-tempered, and just an all-around dragon, right? So one of my favorite scenes for Korthi is he climbs up this mountain to this dragon's lair and then starts chucking apples at the dragon. Hey, pay attention to me. I have questions for you. Which is just like, you are a giant screaming idiot, my dude, and I like it. Yeah, because he doesn't. He's not he does it knowing it's a stupid thing to do, which is part of the charm of the thing. And there are several times where Corthy does things like this. Corthy has an incredible amount of self-confidence, not necessarily arrogant. He does it knowing it's kind of stupid, but also trusting himself to get himself out of the situation. And those are the moments when he is at his best.
Yes. Outside of the characters, the story, the actual pacing of the story is quite solid. The prose,
it's kind of slow.
But it's still
the prose
there's a variety.
Is solid, but
they give you a variety of conflict and of interactions and perils, and the character, the way the chapters are swap between characters, they don't break you up in the middle of an important or interesting scene. All the characters have their small narratives, and almost every chapter has something interesting happening. Some form of peril, some form of internal conflict. Even as you go into the second part, and Corthy and Ayla get into their romance, and those chapters are kind of the weakest part of the book.
Yeah.
But the other characters, their stories are starting to really pick up at this point.
Yeah.
And so it's just, and pacing is also like just from the way how long scenes last, how long chapters last, how it progresses and the shape of events. All this was well handled.
Yes.
Not extraordinary, but by any degree or whatever it is, but it was just a consistently entertaining book.
Yes.
Strangely, though, it's like not even criticisms per se. One of the most relevant things to me is that it's not a memorable book. It's not a book that left me with a strong impression. It's a book that I almost forgot a lot of what happened the moment I finished it. And even if the ending, which was actually quite surprising.
The ending was basically a standout for the book and other books. Like, the last 20% of the book is fantastic.
I wouldn't go so far, but it completely changes the dynamics of the story. It throws in actual threat and challenge and all the...
It capitalizes on threat, owns its threat, and actually
commits to it.
It makes a promise that it keeps, per se.
Potentially.
Well,
happening off screen.
So it's like the book, what I mean is a lot of books kind of wave a knife around, threaten a little, and then no one ever gets stabbed.
Yeah.
Somebody got stabbed in the end of the book, basically.
Yes, and this completely changes the dynamic of the book, and yet it did nothing to make me want to continue reading the series.
Yeah, it's like if the sequel keeps the speed and the good graces earned in the last 20% of the book, the series is well worth the read. I have not read the sequel yet, but the first 80% of the book, with how directionate it felt because only one of the 4 characters had any kind of personal drive, that is a depressingly large hurdle to overcome.
Part of it is because you had the 80% where it felt largely directionless, and you go, okay, but the last one was great, this is good, and you go, wait, there's 10 books in this series. It was like, and that completely flicked off any potential of the series actually having a core, solid narrative.
Yeah.
It just...
Now that you mention it, that does kind of wave a red flag that the series might lack focus. We might want to talk about Maddie, though, because we completely skipped over her.
I did like Maddie. Maddie was, like, personality-wise, kind of my favorite character to a degree. Because Maddie was
rebellious.
Unremittingly rebellious and...
But also willing to be like other people, right? But not in I'm so weird and wacky type of way. She's just not going to conform.
And that alone is kind of appealing. But in part because she also stuck by it.
And it's consistent through the book. She's kind of disrespectful to authority, and she does not tolerate BS.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And which gets her into a lot of trouble because she's part of the military, and basically, as a private, you're supposed to tolerate the BS of your superiors, and she does not.
But part of her character really shines when she finally meets Black Rose. And I don't want to get into too much about Black Rose, but Black Rose is an incredibly sour, threatening, bitter character. And also ancient and sort of kind of a bitter wisdom to it. And very threatening, but her relationship with Maddie really pops in every scene they interact with.
Blackthorn is probably the best character.
Black Rose.
Black Rose is probably...
Agreed, best character. You don't get a whole lot of her, and you don't necessarily like her, but you like what she represents and what she represents for Maddie. Because like a lot of Maddie's narrative is the fact not only is she rebellious, but she has no place to belong.
Yes.
And that is a huge part, but also a really compelling narrative. But it's kind of nebulous surrounding the character of having no place to belong. And her narrative is kind of finding her place, and her place is with Black Rose.
Maddie has tried to join up in various squads of the military. She gets kicked out of every single one of them because she will not tolerate BS, will not bow down to authority. And so she's given this last chance before she is sent
to basically go out into the field and fight the lizard monsters, which is a suicide.
Yes. But then she is kind of given this last chance, this saving grace, and in a secret kind of mission. That's where she meets Black Rose.
And Black Rose is every bit as, not nonconformist, but every bit as sort of a negative maverick. Completely, like, just ruins everybody around her, like, pushes, just very disruptive, and it's just, they occupy the same character space in a regard with how the people around them, so they actually work really well together.
The villains for the story I actually quite like. They only show up every so often. They're the gods, right? They're the gods ruling and controlling the city. And everyone has to tiptoe around them because the gods are a little short of insane.
They're all sociopaths.
Sociopaths, and it actually makes really enjoyable villains because everyone has to tiptoe around them and not say anything, or elsewise they're just basically dead and tortured.
I did kind of enjoy the space they inhabited in the story as the powerful sociopaths in charge, without being like really overtly, most cases, really overtly malevolent. I'm evil. Dark Lord is going to murder 300 million people just because I can. Because they are managing the city, and they're not being unnecessarily, in most cases, tyrannical about it, but they are very much oppressive. I don't have any much more I really want to say about it. And so I'm going to cut you off, toss you out a window, throw a shovel after you, have you dig yourself a hole, and then cover yourself with moss and dandelions.
I don't really want a hole, thank you.
How about a crypt?
How big is it?
About this big. For those who can't read it because their camera cut out,
3 inches.
About 3 inches. Like, maybe put an eye in.
Do I at least get cool Gothic architecture?
Yes, definitely. Like, no point in having a crypt without cool Gothic architecture.
Okay, I'll take a crypt then.
I think that's it. Au revoir. Goodbye, our miserables.
Hopefully we didn't drag along too long.
We definitely did.
Oh, completely.
Nobody listened to us. They're out dying in a gargle of foam, and we could say whatever we want and nobody would know.
That means we can say whatever we want. Say something deeply insulting and controversial.
That's exactly what we will say. But we're not going to say what we're going to say. We're just going to think it really hard.
We're trying to come up with something to say right now, in case you didn't realize. Salt. No, we already did something with salt.
We could do pepper. That's a close similar.
No, pepper is boring after the salt thing. Whatever. We'll just come up with something controversial next time. Toodles.
Toodles.
Fare thee well, our future friends.